Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Kamhi, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings. Thank you so much for joining me, Kamhi, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC in Garden City, New York. You can listen on air, live, or online at iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn app, smart speakers, nccradio.org, or on our own WHPC app. And podcasts of the show are available afterwards, too, on our archive, so be sure to visit that. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we are so happy to have as our guest Dr. Kylie Burton. Dr. Burton is an international best-selling author with her book, Why Are My Labs Normal? She specializes in functional medicine, helping thousands of individuals with seemingly impossible health struggles to find answers, healing, and hope, even if they've been told their blood work is normal. She also teaches practitioners, and she hosts her top-rated podcast called Beyond the Diagnosis. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Kylie.
Thank you for having me. It sounds like you've been doing this show for a long time.
This show has been on since 1990, but it's not my oldest radio shows. I have radio shows that are on much longer, and I've been doing functional medicine long before that word existed. We used to call it natural medicine and alternative medicine, but I really like the name of your book, Why Are My Labs Normal? Because so many individuals who sought out any kind of natural healing really were told that they're fine when they knew they did not feel fine, and then they were additionally told that all their labs were normal, exactly the name of your book. So I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, it's what my specialty is, because we always get told, or so many people get told, that their blood work is normal, yet they feel like crap. So we like to dive into the blood work a little bit different so that we can get different results with those same type of clients.
So much so, because one thing we used to actually test for were pesticides, herbicides, and heavy metal levels. And we were actually told by the Office of Professional Medical Conduct that we were over-testing, and the practice itself was sued because of testing for those kinds of things.
Really?
Believe it or not.
You gotta love our government.
Anyway, but what you're doing is so helpful, because I'm sure so many patients who come to you, they go, my labs are normal. And of course, then the next step is their conventional doctor will usually put them on antidepressants because they're very depressed, because they feel terrible, even though they cannot seem to find an organic cause.
Exactly, yeah. They get put on antidepressants, or they get told that it's because their mom and they need to go sleep for longer. So
what led you to be really focused and become an expert in what is normal blood work and the additional, more deep look that you can take?
Well, it started when I was back in chiropractic school. I'm a chiropractor by degree. I graduated in 2017, so not too long ago. But I had a person come in from the community when I was in a clinical setting, and she had had a migraine for 3 years. She was in her mid-50s, and just, when you live life like that, there's no point in living, right? So she was just at her, I'm going to try this, and if it doesn't work, I don't know what I'm going to do kind of stage. And I got all of her labs, her MRI scans, her CT scans, her blood work, all of the things that she had had up to that point, and it had all come back negative or normal. And I realized right then that if I wanted to get different results, I couldn't look at people the same way. I couldn't look at their lab tests the same way. So that was the first start of my journey. Then I get out to owning my own practice, and we have a lot of really cool functional medicine lab tests at our disposal and what we're taught. And I found that those are expensive, and not very many people will choose to purchase them in addition to some extensive treatment plan. So I had to figure out what could I use that they already had to get me the information I needed so that they could get better. And because my goal is when people come to me, I don't want to be just another doctor in their story. I want to be the last one that they see because their story changes.
Well,
so
that's true.
I started looking at the blood work that they already had in a very unique way.
Well, that's really interesting because like you said, Dr. Burton, are a variety of what we might call functional medicine diagnostic tests, but they're not usually covered by health insurance, and they are quite costly. So what you're saying is that you looked at something that might be more routine and could be ordered, and people maybe had with them already, and you were able to look at those same numbers and see a little bit more depth into what's going on with that person.
Exactly. Yeah. We can dive into some numbers if you'd like to.
Well, let's take something that many people have heard of and probably have, and they've had it done to themselves, and that would be a CBC, which really just means a complete blood count. What do you mean by looking more deeply at, let's say, that most people have?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite lab tests. And why? Because everybody has it. And two, because as I call it, the lab test worth the price of gold. When you know how to read it correctly, it's worth the price of gold. Otherwise, it's just pointless if you're reading it from a perspective of diagnosing. So when I read blood work, I don't read it to diagnose. I read it to figure out why is this person unhealthy and what journey do they need to go on to get healthy? And there's a big difference. So I don't treat diagnoses. I don't treat symptoms. I treat an unhealthy individual. And that's the way I look at the blood work. So inside the CBC, the very top marker is called the white blood cell count, the WBC. And that WBC is indicative of infections. However, it's not going to trigger anybody or your primary care Western medicine type doctor who's been taught a different way to read blood work unless it's over like 20. And if it's over 20, we got something really bad going on. I want to see it between 5 and 8. So if it's less than 5 or greater than 8, I know that this individual is fighting a low-grade infection. I don't know what type of infection yet, but I do know that some type of infection, and those infections can wreak havoc on any part of the body. So it can lead to things like anxiety and depression. It can lead to things like chronic fatigue or joint pain or gut problems or oftentimes autoimmune diseases. So it's just a matter of what does that marker tell me, and then correlating it to the symptoms. And the symptoms just show up because there was a trigger that triggered the genes to start showing the symptoms. So white blood cell count less than 5, greater than 8 triggers infection. So if you have your blood work, go grab it as we talk about more of
that's what I was going to say, because
markers.
This is not really rocket science, reading our blood work. And I always tell all of my clients over the many, many years that they need to keep a copy of their blood work. We used to always say in a manila folder, like printed, which is actually still how I do mine. But also electronically. They're usually available on your doctor's portals these days, because just what Dr. Burton is saying is so important. The only thing a conventional doctor will pay attention to is if it has fallen off the edges, either way low or way high, and then it shows up usually in red. But there's a vast range, and there's a range of normal. And what Dr. Burton is doing is she's tightening those normal numbers so that we can take action before it falls off of one edge or another.
Right. So again, it's before it falls off the edge of the diagnosis, because you have to get so bad before you reach that diagnosis stage. We're talking, this is someone who's sick and tired of being sick and tired, who doesn't feel like themselves, who knows something's wrong, and yet every single time they go to the doctor, oh, your labs look great. See you again in a year for the same result. And nothing changes because we're not trained to read blood work in the right way when it comes to chronic illness.
And this is something that's such a great technique that I really think every doctor even should have your book, Why Are My Labs Normal? Because even without ordering, let's say, additional expensive labs, which, by the way, I think are really fabulous if someone can do that. And sometimes doctors offer, something that isn't that expensive, like one amount that you can get quite a bit done that's much deeper in terms of understanding your metabolism. But I love this approach of just looking and sort of tightening up that normal range to something that you see that people are falling off of. What we also did too was a dark field analysis where we take a drop of blood and put it on the microscope, because you might have an absolutely normal number, like you're talking about a white blood cell count, and yet the cells themselves are either too large, like macrocytic, too small, microcytic, or in the case of white blood cells, you can even see, are they actively moving around and gobbling up through phagocytosis some of those things that shouldn't be there. There's all kinds of things that shouldn't be there. And very often the number is fine, but their activity is not.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about those white blood cells, because these guys are cool.
Please do.
If you look in the CBC and you have the white blood cell count as the very top marker, then the red blood cell counts, and there's a whole bunch more like MCV, MCHC, all the things. Skip down to the bottom, the last 5 markers inside of CBC with differential. It needs to have that with differential part, because these 5 markers are the differential. So if you just have a CBC, you're not going to see it. If you have a CBC with differential, thank goodness, because these 5 markers are very, very important to figuring out what type of infection your body is fighting.
So wait, we're going to go further into that, but what could someone do? Could they, knowing this and having this knowledge you just shared, even if they're just listening on the radio and they're going to go to their doctor, tell them to mark the form to say CBC with diff is how it's usually written. Yes, for sure.
Yeah, that for sure. And be demanding about it. Don't just let them get off the hook and check the wrong box with just the CBC. CBC with differential. That differential starts with the neutrophil count. And that neutrophil count, to me, the magic number is 60%. Now make sure it's the percentages, not the absolute values. Sometimes you'll get absolute values, especially if you're in Canada. The percentages are what you want to pay attention to. So 60% is the magic number for the neutrophil count. If it's over 60%, now I know we're fighting a bacterial infection, because that's mostly what neutrophils do. They specialize in fighting bacterial infections. What can this bacterial infection cause? Well, things like gut problems. So if you've ever heard the term SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, there's a fancy breath test you can do for SIBO, or you can just look at this neutrophil count. And inside the body, what it feels like are gut problems and or joint pains. So for example, I had a young mom, she was my age, around her early 30s, with a 3-year-old and like a 1-year-old. And one morning she woke up and couldn't move her shoulder. And of course, going back to medical terminology and diagnoses, they threw out the term frozen shoulder syndrome. So she went to her primary care doctor. She tried massage therapy. She tried chiropractic. She tried all the things on her shoulder. Nothing worked. So again, I'm not treating a diagnosis and I'm not treating symptoms, but I'm going to figure out inside the blood work what's really going on in her body. And her neutrophil count was at 88%. It was one of the highest I'd ever seen up to that point. And I said to myself, okay, knowing all my training and my knowledge, there is no reason why a bacterial infection would cause frozen shoulder syndrome. But the only way to find out is to treat it and then see what happens to her shoulder. So we did. I put her on like 3 months worth of supplements to tackle the bacterial infection and then to rebuild the gut afterwards. Her shoulder was just fine. Within the 3 months, not only was her shoulder moving fine, but her mood swings were gone. Her generalized joint pain was gone. Her husband emailed me and said, like, I feel like I have my wife back. So you never know what you'll find inside the blood work or what it's going to appear like in the individual.
That's so
That was
true.
just a fun
So
story.
I do want to remind our listeners that you're listening to Herbally Yours right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. And you can always listen on air, live, or online at any of your favorite podcast venues. And today we have as our guest Dr. Kylie Burton, and she is explaining to us how you can use your own blood work. If you're hearing this part of the show and you missed what she said earlier, once we're over and we're not live anymore, then the show will be archived, so you can always check back. And it's really interesting if you do pull out your own blood work and then follow along with the show. Also, her book is called Why Are My Labs Normal? And of course, she's asking that because so many of her patients come in and they go, I feel terrible even though my blood work is normal. But when she looks at it, even without doing more extensive testing, she has a different opinion. I just want to make a comment about frozen shoulder because I recently experienced that myself. Lasted a long time, but one thing that I found was amazingly perfect and helpful for that is a specific homeopathic called sanguinaria. And homeopathy is so interesting because if you looked up a repertory for frozen shoulder, it actually discusses other remedies specific for if it's a left shoulder versus sanguinaria if it's a right shoulder. So that is helpful as well. But tell us what you did in terms of trying to look at the infection factor. What supplements did you suggest for her?
Well, I use a company called Systemic Formulas. They have a wide variety of herbs included in their supplements, so it doesn't take much to get the job done. And they have some very good infection destructors as part of their regimen. The old products that I used were called Bactrex and Fungdx. So whenever I see a bacterial infection, I'm always going to treat fungal too. Even though there's not a specific marker inside the CBC for a fungal infection, I know that infections are rarely standalone. They're mostly co-infections. So we tackled the bacterial infection with some like antibacterial herbs and oils that are inside this Bactrex supplement, and then the fungal portion inside the Fungdx. Now, they have new supplements out, which I am now using, called BioClear 1 and BioClear 2. Those also get the job done. So that was the main two. We had a binder on to make sure that the bad guys were eliminated, the toxins were eliminated. And once we got the bad guys out, we got to get the good guys back in. So we have things like prebiotics and probiotics and fiber and enzymes and HCl and all the things that the gut needs. We got to replenish those things as well. And there's a variety of supplements, but I use mostly that formula, those formulas for the line from Systemic Formulas.
So those are like broad spectrum antimicrobial agents,
exactly.
Mostly botanical. So they're not necessarily a pharmaceutical, but we do quite well in herbal medicine with botanicals because they do usually cover different forms. So that's what you're looking at, like clear out the bad guys, basically. And that's interesting that it would help a frozen shoulder. Yeah,
and like I said, you never know till you treat. So you just treat whatever the blood work tells me to treat and see what happens. And when the body goes from unhealthy to healthy, symptoms just resolve, whatever those symptoms are.
Whatever it is, that's true. So you discussed someone getting a hold of their blood work, and probably most people do have a diff, what you were explaining, a CBC with differential. I usually see that on most blood work. When would be a situation when you wouldn't see that?
When the doctor was lazy and didn't order it.
Oh, but that would be, right. So you need to speak up for yourself and ask for it.
Yeah, speak up for yourself and get a CBC with differential. Because the neutrophil count is just one number. The other number I want to share with the audience is the lymphocytes. And the lymphocyte marker is right underneath the neutrophil count. And these guys are responsible for viruses. So if your lymphocyte marker is over 30%, That means your body's fighting a low-grade virus. Now, these are things that you cannot go to the doctors and ask for an H. pylori, C. diff, E. coli, Campylobacter, COVID, whatever viral test you want to get tested on. They're not going to come back positive because they're not bad enough to elicit a positive test result. So think about Epstein-Barr virus, also known as mono. By the time somebody gets a positive Epstein-Barr virus test, they're so tired they can barely walk up the stairs. But there's a lot of grades of activity between extreme activity causing a positive Epstein-Barr virus test and a little bit of activity causing your chronic fatigue or anxiety and depression, which are the two biggest things with viruses. So look at the lymphocyte marker. If it's over 30%, so 30% is the magic number, you're fighting a low-grade virus. And there's a reason why you're tired. It's not because you're a mom and you need antidepressants or you just need to sleep more. There's actually a reason why your body doesn't have energy to do much else. It's too busy fighting these guys. And I can't tell you what viral, I can't name the virus, and I don't really care either. Because, in the herbal and the supplement world, an antiviral tackles a wide variety of viruses, not just one. So it doesn't change my treatment plan at all.
So that's what you're looking at is even if the person presented herself in that case to you with a specific indicator, which is something that people often do come in for chiropractics for painful conditions. That's a very common thing. And yet you're looking at her full metabolic profile and seeing what could help, try to balance it and then see if her specific symptom just takes care of itself once the body's in better shape.
Yeah, once again, the body tools. So I just want to share one more thing when it comes to blood work here. I wanted to share the neutrophils and the lymphocyte count for a reason. Because if you noticed and paid attention, the neutrophil count was 60% and the lymphocyte count was 30%. That is a 2-to-1 ratio. That's what we want to see. But a lot of times, especially as this world gets, and Americans keep getting sicker and sicker, and we keep spending more and more money on healthcare systems that's not working, the numbers start to approach each other, the neutrophil count and the lymphocyte count. When they start to become like a 42% and a 44%, or a 48% and a 40%, and they start meeting in the middle, we're going to call that a 1-to-1 ratio. And when that happens, when you see that in your blood work, now things shift because now you're fighting some autoimmune stuff. Can I tell you what autoimmune disease?
Please do.
Do I care? No, because it's back to the immune system and figuring out what triggered the immune system to start attacking. Depending upon your genes, depends on where it attacks. So like I have Parkinson's that runs in my family. It's going to attack the spine and the nervous system. Somebody else has Hashimoto's in their family. It's going to attack the thyroid. Someone else has rheumatoid arthritis in their family, and it's going to attack the joints. But you can find these hidden gems, these hidden patterns inside your regular blood work. And it's a game changer for not only if you have a diagnosis, you can go back like an autoimmune disease and figure out what triggered my autoimmune disease. We talk about the flares. So, for example, I had a patient with MS in her mid-30s. She got MS, and she was doing some trial injection thing where she'd have to go down to the local hospital once a month and get this injection. And the injection would put her basically bedridden for 3 days. And she had 3 teenage boys. So it wasn't like she could do this every month and survive. So I had her call down to the hospital and say, okay, what do I need to do to get off of these injections? And they literally told her to stop coming. Okay, so she stopped going. And what I found inside her blood work was not only that 1-to-1 ratio, but she had a very depleted vitamin D status, which we all know is very important for the immune system. And 2, we had to tackle some parasites. And those parasites are also found in the CBC with differential. But once we tackled the parasites, rebuilt her gut, got her vitamin D up, all of these so-called MS flares that we hear in commercials are gone. Now, I don't know if I will never say that I cured her MS, and I don't know if that's the case because you'd have to go and and then get MRIs and see what happened to the lesions, right? But I know that she doesn't have the symptoms anymore.
Yeah. Isn't that
great? As long as
great?
she's on a high dose vitamin D, she feels great.
That's another interesting thing, because they used to regularly test for vitamin D levels, and I'm sure you find as a good piece of information to know. But now, for instance, Medicare won't test for vitamin D anymore.
Yeah, that's when you pull out your cash book.
Yeah, it's really sad because it's such a simple test, and it's linked to so many great support for just wellness.
Yeah, and that normal lab range for blood vitamin D, 32 to 100, I mean, that's crap. If you're in your 30s or your 40s in vitamin D, you're so depleted, even 50s. I want to see people around 80 to 100, and I don't care if it's above 100.
Right, so you're more worried about it being low. So if you're not able to get that reading, I guess you can just recommend they take vitamin D because, there's not much. You can get a high amount, but it would be unusual.
I've never seen somebody with a toxic level of vitamin D.
I never have either, and I've been doing this a lot longer than you.
I think we're just we're made to fear vitamin D levels, and it's like, why? It's so important in the body. Why not just consume it like candy?
And, get some sunshine, and it's, inexpensive. You can get really good high quality with no additives, just like in olive oil. It's just really, really important number that they used to regularly include, and the regular blood work no longer does. So just tell us before we leave for today, it's so interesting to talk to you, Dr. Kylie Burton, and your wonderful book. How can people find you and get a copy of your book?
You can actually grab the book on Amazon. It's called Why Are My Labs Normal by Dr. Kylie Burton. So grab it on Amazon wherever you are in the world. And I have a podcast you can tune into called Beyond the Diagnosis with Dr. Kylie.
And that's what we've been talking about today, how people can find out more about why they don't feel well. And also, are you seeing clients virtually these days?
Oh, yes.
That's great.
I only do virtual.
That's excellent. So that's one thing that whole disruption actually, I think, was a positive, that people can access really excellent healthcare providers wherever they are. So that's really important information. So thank you so much for being our guest today right here on Herbally Yours.
Thanks, Ellen.
And thank you, listeners, for listening to Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamhi, at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.